Welcome to the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transportation in North America and our 75-minute webinar. You are among the 270 people registered to attend today. I'm Martin Crilly, Fellow of the Institute and your moderator. Our Pacific chapter is most grateful to CP Rail for their generous sponsorship of this event. Our focus today is the supply chain between Asia and North America passing through the BC coast. In fact, I'm right here on the BC shoreline, midpoint on the east side of Vancouver Island in the town of Comox. And that name comes directly from the local First Nations, the Comox and the Pentlatch. If I take a shovel, walk 100 meters and dig down half a meter, I'll strike a midden of charred clamshell fragments left long ago by picnickers, sometimes mixed in with those clamshells. You can find stone artifacts, some of which have been dated to around 500 AD. And that's something to marvel at and a reminder that human beings dwelt right here so long ago. It's my good fortune and privilege to live here in good relations with my neighbors on this historic BC coast. I'm thinking of that coast today. In Act 1 of our webinar, we'll look at the disruption of container movement and its roots in the import surge, the 2 years of pandemic, and the November floods. What's the operating condition of the system today from the perspective of each link in the supply chain? Then later, about halfway through our webinar in Act 2, we'll look to the future and discover how the system is responding towards recovery for a more fluid and orderly operation. So let's introduce our 6-member panel today. Each member represents a crucial and interdependent link in the supply chain. I'm going to turn first to Robert Lewis Manning to introduce himself. Robert.
Hey, good morning and afternoon. I'm Robert Lewis Manning and the president of the Chamber of Shipping based in Vancouver, representing carriers, their agents, and also shippers operating in Western Canada. And today I'm coming from Vancouver and the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Michael.
Hi there, Michael Bentley. I'm the head of business development for DP World here in Canada. I've been working with the company for over 20 years and focused on new business opportunities for our terminals here in Canada, which span 4 terminals in BC and 1 in New Brunswick. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. Peter.
Good morning and good afternoon to those of you in the East. My name is Peter Xotta. I'm Vice President of Operations and Supply Chain for the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. Been with the Port Authority over 25 years, all of it occupied in kind of operating and customer matters. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Dave.
Good morning, good afternoon. Dave Earle, the BC Trucking Association, speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Catsi people, members of the Coast Salish Nation.
Jeff.
Morning, everyone. Thanks, Martin. Jeff Edwards from CP. I'm the Assistant Vice President of Market Strategy and Demand Management, and I'm coming to you today from Dallas, Texas, on the road, and excited to be here.
Thanks for making it, Jeff, on your business trip. Bruce.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Bruce Rogers. I'm the Executive Director of CIFA, the Canadian International Freight Forwarders Association. Our regular members are the freight forwarders, the freight brokers, as well as the drayage operators. And I am positioned out of Toronto.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bruce. So to the attendees here today, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box, and the panelists will see any questions that you want to put into that box. Please do so, and we'll do our best to address them. The chat box, conventional in some Zoom seminars, is disabled at this time, so look for the Q&A box. So I've asked Peter Xotta from the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, who perhaps has a wide overview, the best central wide overview of the system, to give us a kickoff with some opening remarks from his perspective. Peter, the floor is yours.
The proverbial mute button. Thank you, Martin. And I just want to say again, thank you to CILTNA for inviting the Port Authority to participate in the session. And of course, thanks to all of you for your time and participation today. Obviously, the Port Authority has a federal mandate to enable trade through the Port of Vancouver while protecting the environment and considering local communities. In that respect, I'd like to, like some of my colleagues on the panel, make an acknowledgement that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Also like to acknowledge today is International Women's Day and thank all of you inspiring women involved in the session today and our industry writ large. Today, I'm going to provide a brief perspective on how global and regional supply chain challenges have intersected, and some ways that we have and are responding to build resilience in the Port of Vancouver, and I look forward to the conversation in that respect. Specific references have already been made to recent extreme weather events. Martin mentioned these, and I want to acknowledge the leadership of the organization and actually the specific individuals on the panel today for their part in helping Canada restore the flow of goods some weeks ago. Folks who aren't on the panel, and I think I also want to acknowledge, is the critical leadership role played by our senior government officials recently. It was a very profound and challenging period, and we saw very, very strong leadership out of both our federal and provincial leaders and in the recovery effort. So just want to acknowledge that. What I hope you take away from my comments today and our discussion is over the last decade, Canada's largest port has been successful in responding to increasing demand for port services and Canadian goods. I'm going to highlight how some of the recent events, though, are a warning against complacency, that the degree of impact on the supply chain that we've experienced appears to be increasing, and our resiliency needs to improve in order to respond successfully to these challenges. The challenges associated with the supply chain globally, particularly over the last 2 years, have highlighted the value, the role, and in some cases, the fragility of global supply chains. Events like the COVID-19 pandemic, flooding, wildfires, and even the blockage of the Suez Canal helped the public get a better understanding, for better or worse, just how complex and essential global goods movement is. For most people, when they refer to what has come to be known as the supply chain crisis, they're referring to the backlogs of shipping containers that have impacted the fluidity of goods around the world. And it makes sense that the container sector is top of mind when it comes to the public who are looking for the goods that they want to consume on their local retailer shelves. From an importer and exporter perspective, containers have become just a top priority with respect to the movement of goods that require security. They are safe, versatile, and a cost-effective way to move many goods. For business and consumers, ocean containers carry the things that we want and need, including clothing, electronics, food, furniture, and of course, many of the exports that dominate the Canadian economy. Globally, the use of containerized trade has been growing for decades, and Canada has enjoyed its position increasing in that respect. During the pandemic, as people shifted their spending towards goods instead of travel, a surge in consumer demand created a domino effect within the supply chain. We saw, amongst other things, freight rates skyrocket on trading routes relevant to Port of Vancouver users. With that, in North America, we experienced a shortage of empty containers available for export. Here on Canada's west coast, we've seen additional supply chain challenges, including a shortage of industrial land for transloading, and of course, the extreme weather that we referenced previously, the wildfires, the severe flooding, only to be followed by some of the normal challenges that we have in December, January, and February, that being extreme cold. Despite all of this, trade through the Port of Vancouver has remained strong, and the Port Authority and our partners have been able to keep our road and rail infrastructure projects moving forward. This while cargo volumes have remained remarkably stable and container volumes notably continue to grow. That's been the result of more than a decade of collaborative infrastructure investment in the gateway to create capacity and enhance fluidity. And the dedicated efforts of every group within the supply chain and port community, many of whom are represented here on the panel today, working hard and together to meet Canada's and Canadians' needs for through this challenging time. However, the work isn't done, obviously, and our eyes are on the future and how to enable Canada's long-term trade through the Port of Vancouver. A key focus for us at the Port Authority has been Canada's West Coast container capacity. Container trade has been and is forecast to continue to grow for years to come. In order to respond to this opportunity and the challenge recent volatility has created, we need to be courageous and take bold, decisive action to protect Canada's trading position. A big courageous step for the port is taking shape in our Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project. I won't go into detail. Most of you are familiar with the work that we're doing in that respect. This project has been designed, obviously, to meet Canada's growing trade needs while minimizing and mitigating the environmental effects. So, work on terminal infrastructure through this and other projects like DP World's Centerm expansion is underway and needs to continue. Work on first and last mile infrastructure, projects like the one that we're doing in Pitt Meadows in cooperation with CP Rail, is underway and needs to continue. And finally, work on digital infrastructure, while not as advanced, is beginning to get traction. So those three pillars of what I'll call the essential infrastructure for Canada to continue to grow its trade position and protect its trade position are things that we need to be courageous and embrace and accelerate to help us better anticipate, assess, and manage future supply chain shocks, by all accounts that are going to be more frequent and more extreme. So that's my brief perspective on how global and regional supply chain challenges intersect and some of the ways that we can continue to build resilience into Canada's largest port and supply chains so that we can meet the future challenges from a position of strength. I know my colleagues on the panel here today will have a whole bunch of interesting comments to make, and I look forward to their comments and our following discussion. I'll toss it back to you now, Martin.
Thanks very much, Peter. That's fantastic. Thanks for setting the scene. I see you as the spider at the center of the web. And now we're going to go over to following the import movement, import direction. Let's turn to Robert Louis Manning to give us the marine perspective of the situation. Robert.
Hi, good morning and afternoon. Thanks again for the invitation, and I'm glad to be here as part of the panel. I think a few acknowledgements. One is on International Women's Day. We don't look very much like the demographic that we're celebrating today. But I can tell you, I work with an incredible group of women leaders. And as soon as many of us aren't here, I know the next tranche of leadership certainly looks very different than the current one. The other group of people I'd like to acknowledge, and as a global industry, of course, are our Ukrainian colleagues, both in Canada and globally. Difficult times, and I know all of us are thinking about the hardships they're enduring and hoping that that doesn't last very long. It's easy to be negative at the moment. We've all had a hard 2 years, but I think I'll talk about three things, and I'll talk about both the challenges, but also the successes, as Peter has mentioned. The first is the human element, people, and then I'll talk about the unexpected and a little bit about weather. And we've all experienced quite a bit of weather in the last couple of years. But first, the human element, which has made everything that much more difficult. Of course, in Canada, we've been dealing with a pandemic as other nations, but it's been quite a success story. And when we look at the level of productivity in comparison to the challenges that it presented, the amount of work that's gone into keeping people safe and healthy throughout the various phases of the pandemic has been nothing short than miraculous. And I think it's a lot of the hard work of all the supply chain stakeholders, the government agencies that have not just acted, but listened at a level I think that is unprecedented. I hate to use the word unprecedented, but when it comes to this pandemic, the flow of communications has been multiple different directions, and it's really helped the supply chain deal with the uncertainty of changing health orders and regulations, and also the different challenges that the pandemic affected people. I think from a seagoing perspective, that challenge was tenfold. We had a demographic of seafarers that was isolated, largely unable to get the health and welfare treatment that you and I and the rest of the people on this webinar would take for granted most days. And their mobility was severely restricted. And to think that shipping companies weren't trying to deal with the welfare of their people and trying to move seafarers around the world in order to do crew changes, it was an incredibly complex issue. It remains pretty complex, but it's getting better. But it's certainly had some major impacts in the first 18 months of the pandemic. Having said that, it is now turning into a more positive situation, and seafarers are getting that treatment. They're getting the mobility that they need in many cases in order for crew changes to happen. And I think we're seeing a higher success rate of crewing around the world, except for perhaps right now in the Ukraine and Russia. So that has been a positive story for the most part. A little bit about the unexpected, and Peter talked about some of the big things and the very obvious ones, perhaps some of the ones that we have forgotten over time. If we go way back to 2019, of course, we had a railway strike. We had protests that lasted months. This was all pre-pandemic. The amount of congestion that was happening and challenges in the supply chain was well before the pandemic. And so we started from a deficit position to begin with. We went from protests to a very difficult winter in 2019 and 2020, and especially for the railways. Then we transitioned to the uncertainty of the early stages of the pandemic. We had further disruption in the summer, as Peter mentioned, from wildfires, and then of course the disastrous floods of last fall. What an incredible 2 to 3 years coming out of a period that didn't look like the one that we're in now with high demand. It was in fact the exact opposite. Capacity was less because it had no choice. And of course, the capacity was difficult to put on quickly in order to address the increased demand and all the disruption. And that disruption wasn't just in Canada or North America, but of course was global. And finally, weather. Weather has played a significant part. And while we often refer to the wildfires and the floods, the reality is that we saw severe weather at sea, especially in 2020 and early 2021, that we've never seen before. Ships were having longer transits, slower transits. They were seeking shelter in places that they've never sought shelter before. And unfortunately, I have to point to the unfortunate incident of the Zim Kingston as, again, another warning sign that the climate in which we're operating in is changing, and the way we operate in the future may have to change. Incidents like that resulted in ships alongside berths or taking up anchorages that had never taken up. In addition to, pandemic delays from ships where there were COVID instances, and certainly many of the terminals have been delayed because a ship just couldn't move. It was in quarantine. But all these have added to an incredibly complex and dynamic environment where, when you're hoping to have maybe a certainty a month out, you were lucky to have certainty 2 days out if you were a carrier or terminal, and I suspect the railways felt the same way or still feel the same way. So all of this has just added on, and of course, on a day like today, we're still seeing those delays. And I think this morning I counted 15 ships at anchor waiting for berths in the port of Vancouver just for intermodal traffic, and these are record levels. On the bright side, we've been fortunate that some of the capacity that was often taken up by other commodities has been available for intermodal freight traffic. So again, some of that is just luck. But again, as Peter said, we can't rely on luck to manage our supply chain in the future. And we've seen just about every possible challenge that could have been imagined, and some that we couldn't have imagined in the last 2 years. So it is a warning sign. And I'll finish that on that note. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robert, for fleshing out our picture that we're developing here of the history and how we got here. I'm now going to turn to Michael Bentley, Terminal Operations, DP World. Michael.
Thank you very much, Martin, and pleasure to be here today. As various others have recognized, DP World, we operate in many different places across Canada where we deal with First Nations and recognize the important role that they play in our operations and our planning for the future. As we get into the issues of reacting to the supply chain, certainly it has forced, I think, all the players in the industry, whether it's terminal operators, rail, trucking, BCOs, to work much closer together, to coordinate, to try and solve the logistics challenges that we've been facing. In our own small way, we've been trying to do that. For example, we ended up with a lot of Canadian containers stuck in Seattle on services that had bypassed Vancouver or never were intending to go to Vancouver. We've run a barge service to try and bring those containers back to Canada rather than relying on trucking, given the shortages and the challenges that we face on the trucking side as well. We mentioned, or Robert mentioned earlier, the Zim Kingston. We took that ship at Nanaimo to try and help, because it was a long operation to clear that ship out, and so freed up GCT's berth so that they weren't having to deal with that. So I think everybody's had to work, very, very in a cooperative manner to try and deal with a lot of these challenges that we've faced. The short sea shipping certainly that we've developed has been a key benefit, and certainly we are looking as DP World providing a lot of more logistics solutions, which is part of our focus as a company around the world. And that's really been a key part of our ability to try and deal with some of the logistics challenges that have emerged out of this crisis. And I think when we talk about the crisis, and particularly when we talk about places like LA, Long Beach, which obviously has an impact on what's happening here in Canada, it's not a lack of capacity in the port side. Okay, this is effectively a breakdown of the entire supply chain, and it always, they say about lack of capacity, but if you look at LA Long Beach, they've probably got 8 million TEUs of unused port capacity, and yet the terminals are completely congested. And it's obviously a number of factors: shortage of truck drivers, changing patterns of BCOs wanting to do more import transload. And this has really highlighted the criticality of inland logistics capability and industrial land in order to take advantage, or to be able to serve the needs of the BCOs. And so what we see is that as we look forward, and we're going through the Centerm expansion project, which Peter made reference to, the key for us in order to be able to fill that is to be able to have the logistics space on the back end to support that. And really, as we go forward and look at any projects in a post-COVID world, we are really focused on the idea of saying, is there going to be enough supporting logistics capability to support that expansion? Because if not, there's absolutely no use in simply building the capacity just for the sake of additional capacity. It has to be there on the rail side, has to be there on the industrial land side, the trucking side. All those all need to match up. And I think everybody in the industry has gotten a much greater sense of awareness of that coming out of the COVID crisis. Thanks, Martin.
Very interesting questions. Very interesting questions that you're raising there, Michael. Thank you for that, and a slightly different perspective. You mentioned truck and rail. Great entree for Dave Earle, BC Trucking Association. Hi, Dave. Your turn.
Yeah, and thanks for having me today, and welcome everybody. In thinking about what to talk about today, Martin gave me some questions to think about, and I thought it might be helpful to provide a bit of a sense of what's happened and what's going on. When we watched COVID take place and really take hold in 2020 and 2021, we were able to continue operating much as most of the people on this call have, as we were an essential service. But what that essential service and that operation has masked is how many people we've lost. Best estimates, best figures we have is we've lost between 10 and 12% of commercial drivers that were operating in 2019 as we head into 2022. Now, we were always going to lose some to retirement, but that rate has been greatly accelerated as individuals who are at or near the end of their careers simply have decided to take a step outside and move back from the industry. What that has done is it just continues to aggravate an already bad situation. In terms of the crises and where we were at with the floods, we adapted as best we could. We lost overnight, literally overnight, about 80% of our east-west capacity in British Columbia. We were seeing on an average day, about 6,000 east-west moves a day into the interior, and that declined to the point that we had one route left that was running at about 800. That route was very difficult terrain. We had drivers that were not comfortable driving it. It's extremely difficult. Early on in the crisis, we had a multiple fatality MVA, which further put some serious reluctance on drivers to be able to move through that route. At its peak, it was operating at 300% of what it normally does in peak volumes over the summer. So the traffic was absolutely horrendous. The local communities were greatly impacted, but we didn't have a choice. So we simply tried to adapt and do what we can. Where we're at now, thanks to some absolutely remarkable senior government leadership right across this entire issue, is we're back to a point where we're able to operate at volumes that we were seeing before the floods in November, but certainly the times are taking longer as we rebuild our infrastructure, rebuild our chains. It's proving to be a significant challenge. Some of the lessons that we've learned going through and what can we do the next time? We're all talking about building back better and making more resilient infrastructure. I had an opportunity to get out to the sites where there's some washouts in the Coquihalla earlier, and I personally can't conceive of what that would look like. The level of devastation, the level of destruction is absolutely beyond belief. We are talking about highways that aren't just damaged, but that don't exist. They are literally gone, and rivers are running where highways used to be. You cannot possibly overestimate the level of devastation, and one of the lessons that we've learned from this is being able to have a plan on the shelf to be able to adapt and move quickly. When this hit, we did take a look at what was available, we being the industry and senior levels of government, to try and find a workaround, and it was all hands on deck, and within 2 to 3 weeks, we had a protocol set up for in-transit moves to be able to move goods through the United States. It was a phenomenal amount of work, even with the planning that was done, and what we learned is it wasn't terribly, well, it wasn't as effective as we hoped. I talked about 6,000 east-west moves pre-flood damage. That's per day. The peak of in-transit moves, we hit just under 300 a day. We ran sessions and training sessions for our members to be able to become able to run in the United States, even under these in-transit provisions. And the cold truth was it would take companies literally months to be able to set up, to be able to run. It just wasn't a viable option for companies that weren't already running in the United States. And for those that were, of course, they were running flat out. So the lesson there for us really is to work with senior governments on both sides of the border to look at protocols, both for disasters east-west and for north-south. When we're talking about earthquake preparedness, disaster preparedness, we need to do some serious work on this and say, what can we pull off and put in place the next day, rather than trying to rely on the heavy and hard and dedicated work of literally dozens of agencies trying to come up with solutions. The last thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was what can those of us on the call do, in terms of resiliency in supply chain and where we're at. What we learned going through and what I learned dealing with and working with shippers and working with our members, those companies that had long-standing commercial arrangements, those companies that had long-standing contracts with carriers were able to weather the storm a lot better than those that didn't. Their rates were much more stable. Their availability to move product was much more predictable. There was a lot more efficiency in that element of the industry than there were with companies who were looking to do the one-off moves and going into the spot market. For those of you that did that, you know what the chaos was, and that chaos existed in the absence of a long-standing relationship. So I'd really encourage everybody to take a look and take an examination of how you can develop those relationships with companies, with organizations, to have those relationships where we're building capacity just in case. Not just in the moment, not just in time, and not devolving every element of risk across the supply chain, because we all know how that ended. I encourage people on the call to look at carriers very, very closely, look at their fuel management strategies, look at their corporate social responsibilities, pull their NSC profiles, their national safety code profiles to see who you're dealing with, and to make sure that you want to have that long-standing relationship with them. So when the next crisis happens, not if, but when, you've got relationships in place to be able to move your goods. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Very interesting call for stability. Moving on to another land carrier mode, rail. Jeff Edwards, the floor belongs to you.
Thank you, Martin. And I want to just thank again everyone for joining us today, and for all the panelists. I'm gonna build a little bit on what each and every one of them have said, and give you a little bit of the context from the rail side. Really, we've talked a little bit about the history on how we got here, and I appreciate the comments from the earlier panelists in talking about that this was well before what we saw in 2021 with the fires and the flooding. But when I look back at 2021 and I look at the panelists and those of you in the audience, what an interesting time to be a supply chain professional. You heard earlier panelists talk about the fact that we're looking at LA Long Beach and how interrelated all of the different functions that go into this supply chain are. It's an incredibly rewarding business to be in terms of the supply chain, and being a part of the Vancouver supply chain has been very interesting for me this year in terms of how much collaboration has gone on and the importance of that, and building on what Dave spoke about in terms of being prepared for these situations going forward and the learnings we can take. So just a little bit from the rail side, when you think about the fires that happened earlier in the year, and then when we hit the flooding, there was some significant resiliency that was shown through the rail corridor, just by the fact that you saw CN and CP working together, moving trains together over the railroad. We had 32 outages on CP. CN had as many or more than we had. And we were back up and running trains from both CP and CN within 6 days. And that wasn't a result of just the work of the railroad. As was mentioned earlier, we saw significant support from both the provincial and federal government in terms of giving us a special designation to allow us to move key critical equipment and supplies into the areas that we needed to be. And we've worked with other provincial governments outside of British Columbia, as that should be in everyone's toolbox when we get into these situations, to work with the critical supply chain partners to ensure that we have access to be able to get the supply chain back up and running. We had the federal government was able to work with us on getting a permit that would often take many, many weeks or months, provide us a permit within 40 minutes. Because it was required for us to get our railroad back up and running. So a thank you to all of those partners that worked with us through those outages. When I look at the impact on rail, and when I think about what makes rail tick, railway is very much driven by resources and where our resources are in the supply chain. You will have heard from a number of the speakers that as we saw issues in the shipping industry, as we've seen issues at different terminals, we've seen situations where we've got all of our assets in one end of the country based on the demand for products. We are always working with our key supply chain partners to ensure that we're getting balance. And that's balance on within each commodity so that we're moving rail cars and assets, crews, containers, both east and west in equal, but also working among commodities. So as we went through the situation with the flooding this year, it was very important that we were working with the port. Peter was a leader in that, as well as with the federal government, to understand what could each terminal take. There were terminals that were filling up because they could not take more product. There were areas that were in desperate need of product, and we think about fuel specifically. So that was identified through the supply chain partners, and that became a major focus of the railway. When we think about what we need to do in the future and going forward to continue to build on the resilience with which we see, we continue to promote the collaboration between all stakeholders, working together to understand where we need to focus our time. CP is, and I know that CN is as well, extremely committed to the continued investment in our corridor, in corridor capacity. And we work very closely with the Port of Vancouver and other stakeholders in the Lower Mainland to ensure that we're investing in projects like Harris Road, like the proposed Kennedy Road, like other projects on the South Shore to support the growth that Michael and his team are doing at Centerm to ensure that not one piece of the supply chain is growing at a pace that's greater than that of another piece of the supply chain. We're always only as good as our weakest link, and working together and understanding where that growth is coming allows us to grow together and to ensure that this supply chain is resilient, not only today, but well into the future. As we all know, investments are many, many years in the future, and planning for today is critically important for what our supply chain and what our capacity is going to be 10, 15 years in the future. I'll turn it over to you, Martin, on that, and I'll look forward to some questions at the end.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Well, we're really fleshing out the picture now. Want to turn finally to Bruce Rogers from the freight forwarding point of view. Welcome, Bruce, your perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin, and it's a pleasure to be here. And you know, from a forwarding perspective, we utilize all the services of the people on this panel today. So I appreciate the views that have been expressed so far. Earlier, Peter talked about the fragility of the supply chain, and the fragility of the supply chain, I'm going to say, was back in 2018. It's been broken since then. We're not at a fragile state. We're at a crisis state, and I can appreciate some of the comments that were made. And Jeff talked about collaboration of the stakeholders. We truly believe that's what it's going to take to get out of the mess that we're in at this point in time. We really need to work together. We need to really work on common solutions. This is a global situation that's occurring, but we need to look internally and look domestically on how do we improve the supply chain overall. Talking about how the situation was created for us, you know, and Peter again mentioned earlier on that consumers' spending habits changed. They went to buying product versus spending their money on leisure travel, which created an increased demand for space. Costs started to escalate, which was addressed, and vessels were being repositioned in order to address the greatest need. As a result of that then expands the supply chain and the transit time to get in, due to the fact that vessels are waiting at berth. Robert touched on that earlier when he mentioned 15 vessels out of Vancouver, and we know, you know, the Port of LA, Long Beach has had up to 100 vessels waiting to berth. From a port facility location, they only have so much capacity in which to offload those vehicles or vessels, and as a result of it, there is a corresponding delay in getting those containers offloaded into the terminals to move to the ultimate destination. So this is creating a significant havoc overall. It's resulting in many more containers being in service in order to service the supply chain due to the fact that there is vessels waiting at sea, waiting to berth. And once those containers get offloaded, it then creates an internal capacity issue within the supply chain. And we know since probably mid-September that we were running into congestion issues out of Vancouver. That situation really started to escalate and create significant havoc. The government has assisted the Port of Vancouver, and we do have some relief now with additional space to handle those empty containers. But this is really a short-term solution. This problem is going to exacerbate as we go forward as well. We know that the vessels are getting larger to handle additional volumes in the coming years. A lot more containers have been ordered to facilitate the supply chain. The problem we have is we don't have the infrastructure in which to handle it. And once those containers hit market, what are we going to do? Where are they going to go? We have problems today, on a global basis, handling the additional volumes. I don't know how we're going to handle this on a go-forward basis, and I think this problem is going to continue throughout 2022 and create some havoc for us in 23. So, I appreciate the comments that have been made, and again, collaboration, I believe, is key. We need to bring the parties together. We need to work on common solutions. We need to listen to each other as we start addressing these supply chain challenges. And really working on common solutions. We can't wait for the government to do everything for us. I think there's steps that we can take as industry participants and as stakeholders that we can do ourselves in order to resolve some of the situations that are continuing into this year and will continue beyond this point in time as well. So I'll stop there for the sake of time, because I know there's other comments you want to address, Martin. And we'll get into it now, I'm assuming.
Super. Thanks very much, Bruce. So now each of our panelists has spoken and put some meat on the table. We do have a picture of what's been happening, and we have been talking about the future. What I suggest now is that as we move into Act 2 of our webinar, we can move into a conversation between the panelists, maybe inspired by some of the questions you see are coming up in the Q&A panel. Looking at what more can be done to, are we through the crisis? Seems not. What more could be done? How long is this going to take? Are we actually, is it going to be months? Is it going to be years? What is it going to, what does the future look like, in your opinion, as we struggle to come to some sort of normality in a time of growth? Does anybody want to pick up on that and kick off the ball here with our discussion?
I'll jump in initially if you wish.
Please.
From our perspective, I think we're going to continue the situation that we're in now through 2022. We expect some relief to occur in 2023. As I mentioned, additional containers will be coming into the market to handle the additional demand. But we're very optimistic with the government lessening restrictions on a global level, that people will start to return to travel, business travel, and spending their money on dollars will go to leisure versus spending on goods. And I think that'll create some much needed release in the supply chain overall. But going forward, I think we need, we need a gateway infrastructure strategy in Canada. We've got the National Trade Corridors Fund. We've got X number of dollars assigned to that. But really, what is the strategy behind that? What is the long range strategy? We don't want to deal with the today issues. We need to look at this long range and what is the strategy? Where should that money be spent? How should it be allocated amongst all the ports in Canada? Where do we get the biggest bang for the buck to improve fluidity of the supply chain overall? I don't believe that exists today, and I think it's something that's urgently required overall. The other thing from a bureaucracy standpoint, Peter did mention the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 expansion project. Our understanding, if that gets approved today, the earliest we'd be looking at it would be at sometime in 2030. I believe that's been on the books for in excess of a decade already. It takes us too long in Canada to make some of these critical decisions that we need to make in order to improve the supply chain, the movement of goods in the supply chain in Canada. And that's just one example, but this one has been on the books a long point of time. And as I stated, we are looking at 2030 at best. And if we have another situation or an increase in volume, we're ill-equipped to handle it within Canada today as well.
Anybody want to pick up, Robert?
Yeah, I would. Thanks. And I think, I just go back to all the opening remarks, and we were walloped by climate change over at least 2 years. And so not only are we walloped by climate change, but we're also experiencing fairly aggressive inflation. So it's all happening at once. But as we talk about the recovery, whatever recovery is, and we can define that later, I think we have to be thinking about decarbonization at the same time. And it adds another level of complexity to all of this across different modes, which are going to face different challenges and different costs, largely on capital assets that, companies need to make decisions today in order to meet fairly aggressive decarbonization targets of 2030, 40, and 50. So I don't think we can do any of this without thinking about that. Otherwise, we're probably fooling ourselves. So, we've been given this wake-up call, and now I think we have to bring those pieces together. And if we're not talking about decarbonization and realistically and aggressively at the same time, then we're probably missing an opportunity. And I don't think we can just think about the resiliency of the supply chain. It's too myopic.
Thank you.
I'd jump in briefly, Martin.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to go back to Bruce's comments and reiterating the collaboration. But Bruce also made the comment that not to rely on government. I think that within the stakeholder group that we have on this panel and in the Lower Mainland, this isn't an ask for regulation to be able to solve this, but we do need to be able to find a path forward with faster decisions on investment, and this group looking at where we need to put that investment, but by no means is the way to do that through government regulation. I think the government has been very supportive in terms of helping us through this, but that next step I don't believe is required. I was adding on to Bruce's comment. I agreed with it very, very strongly.
Yeah, I think this question of what are the vehicles for this coordination, how much do they exist today? Very interesting question. I mean, been many attempts over the past decades to have a gateway focus. And it sounds like it's a process of constant renewal of that, of some sort of coordinating function. Who would like to pick up any of the questions in the Q&A, or continuing with the theme that Robert raised having to do with climate change?
Yeah, Martin, there's one interesting question I saw in there. Is a question about whether there's ever been a stress test done, like the US banks after the financial crisis. And, has there been a stress test done on the Canadian supply chain? And I'm certainly not aware of one. Of course, we as a company, and I'm sure every organization does their own risk planning, risk assessments, this type of thing. But we talk about a stress test for the entire Canadian supply chain, and I don't think it's been done. One of the interesting things, and I talked earlier about LA Long Beach, everybody thinks LA Long Beach is the linchpin of US trade, and yet it's responsible for about 35% of US container volumes. Vancouver handles about 50% of Canada's container volumes. So as we talk about stress testing and the need to stress test in the future, it all comes down to Vancouver and the inland linkages to Vancouver, and how can what are the stresses? How can we mitigate against those stresses? Because it's 50% of our international trade on containers.
How would you do such a stress test on a system? Like, what is it? Is it a tabletop exercise? What is it? I can't even conceive of how you would do that.
I can't conceive of it either, but it's probably something that all the key players, represented by the types of people that are here today, are sitting down, government as well as government, to actually think through and put together a coherent strategy as to how we de-risk and create those necessary redundancies in the supply chain.
And who would pull such a thing together? Would it be the port? Would it be government? Would it be some voluntary gathering?
it has to be, I think it has to be government role. And, you know, the government has to, I think the Ministry of Transport, others need to be thinking strategically about the long-term future and how we deal with these issues that have been exposed, because whether it's earthquakes or tsunamis or floods or fires, these types of events will continue to happen and we need to be ready for it.
I might jump.
Michael,
Sorry,
go ahead,
Mark.
Peter. No, Peter, go ahead.
I wanted to jump in. I mean, I think they're great observations, and I think the challenge for government in this space is respecting some of the views that we've heard from some of the panels. On the one hand, the private sector needs to do what it does in response to its customer needs and its shareholders, and Canada, I think, has a role in making sure they have a view of how that system is performing. And so the data piece we know Canada is seized with in terms of creating, I'll call it the single source of truth. I don't know how close we are to achieving that. But then from a policy perspective, we have something that we've enjoyed a lot of benefit from, and that is the National Trade Corridor Fund. So that is really not directing the private sector, but it's a framework to allow the private sector to bring projects forward and identify the merits of investments, co-investments, federal, provincial, private, et cetera, in combination. And Jeff mentioned the work that we're doing with CP. So I think that, you know, I'm thinking about the question around a stress test, that work that the port is involved in kind of modeling and forecasting on a regional level, sharing that information with other stakeholders and then seeking funding from Canada isn't, strictly speaking, you know, kind of a network level stress test, but it is intended to get us identify the most pressing infrastructure or operating issues to allow us to sustain the growth that we've had. Over the last 15 years, we've had a lot of success with that. Right now, we're in a crazy time when there are more stressors on the supply chain than we've ever experienced all at once. And I think that's kind of the conversation that needs to unfold, and that Canada, frankly, has to take a lead role in, because the individual actors here, you know, obviously all have their role to play in that, but that 100,000-foot view is really Canada's domain.
Peter, just a question to you: if you consider sort of what was a normal condition of the whatever normal used to be, condition of the system in the past, let's say in the mid-teens, 2016, 2017, and we are compared with where we are today, how much are we recovered back to what sort of on the normal track of operation of the system? Like, how back to normal are we?
Well, maybe just provide a little bit of context, picking up on Michael's example of LA. You know, I would hope that we aren't sitting here 5 years from now with latent capacity in our supply chain that we cannot extract or access because of our lack of collaboration or lack of a systemic way of accessing it. That's what I think all of us are seized with. Certainly at the port, we're trying to think and be proactive in that space. In October of 2021, and I've got these data points. So coming off of a significant disruption in the supply chain, in the Canadian supply chain, that being the wildfires, we actually responded as a gateway, the collective we, quite effectively. So at that time, we had intermodal or container vessels arriving in Vancouver would have about a 30% chance of going to anchor. And if they did go to anchor, they would be there for 3 or 4 days. Contrast that with Los Angeles or I'll call it other West Coast ports, where your chance of going to anchor was in the 90+% range, and you would be there for 12 to 14 days. So even after a moderate, a very significant, but I'd say from a time perspective, at least moderate disruption to the supply chain, all of the actors on the call here and others were able to respond and restore service very effectively. And I think that industry, the customer and shippers recognize that, because demand for routing through Vancouver continued at that time to be strong. Robert Louis Manning mentioned this morning we have 15 container vessels at anchor, the highest number that we've ever had. and we have 13 or 14 coal vessels also at anchor. So clearly, the combination of the series of events, the disruption in the fall, and then winter weather, not just for transportation service providers, but for people who are out mining and doing things in winter after you've shut down or down tools for some time, is taking us some time to get to respond to. Martin, I don't know that we'll have this combination of events again, but I think we need to turn our attention to, well, if we do, what do we do? Because this time frame is not acceptable to shippers. I take Bruce's comment, and we've got to find ways to better anticipate and respond to these things. That's going to take more effective collaboration than I think we have. Even though it's been very good in this gateway relative to other ones, we need to actually continue to push that envelope.
Okay. Anybody want to pick up from this? I don't want to be asking all the questions. I really like to suggest, ask you, Peter, suppose the weather is fine in the next few years. Okay, a big assumption. Suppose we don't have another variant, big assumption. Just acting, basically with what we've got today and plans in place today being fulfilled in an orderly fashion, would things be back to normal next year, the year after? Next month? What is the time scale we're looking at? Crystal ball, I guess.
Yeah, I would agree with Bruce that 2022 is going to be a challenging year. Barring other significant events, we'll start to level things out. There's latent capacity, for example, in we hear about the container freight rates. The disruption is consuming a considerable amount of ocean freight capacity just because of the dysfunction in that supply chain. I'm told it's in the order of 10 to 15%. That's 2 years worth of new buildings for that industry. So that's a very significant amount of capacity in a normalized situation that would be available to stabilize things. And I'm sure that's the case for other service providers as well. We need to see some stability. Controlling that obviously is a lever that no one has to pull. We need to continue to work through this.
The other part on that, I think, Martin, when you said getting back to normal, I think we have to define what normal is.
Yeah.
If we've got importers or exporters on the line, they may be looking at, from a pricing perspective, are the rate. I know we don't want to really touch on that today. It's a pretty broad subject, but back in 2017, 2018, the carriers were struggling to make a profit, and now we've got the situation where the carriers are doing very, very well. So I don't think 2018, I don't think we're ever going to revert back to 2017, 2018 levels. And I don't think today's pricing levels are sustainable either. So I think when you talk about getting back to normal, I think there's going to be a rebalancing of what those prices are. And I think it's going to be somewhere in the middle that people are going to have to adapt to, and that will become the new. So I think we've got to be very cautious when we start talking about back to normal, what that really means for people, because I think people have different perspectives of that.
Okay.
I'll add, and maybe Jeff will want to jump on this afterwards. When we talk about capacity, we're also talking about competing commodities. So while some of the bulk export commodities have actually seen a downward trend for the last year, that's not expected to be long-lived. And of course, we will see competition for rails, ports, and places for ships, hopefully in the not too distant future, but that will present challenges. And I think I'm not sure there is a normal as far as capacity and pricing. We're going to see adjustment, and it is going to look different after 2022 is my expectation. And I think there were a number of comments in the Q&A about what's going to be the impact of higher oil prices. U.S. just announcing a ban on Russian imports today, so we're going to see other challenges, and I don't think they're going to disappear quickly. So we're probably looking at a new normal, but the other panelists might want to challenge that.
I'll jump in, Robert, and I think it comments again on my comment on balance, and I think you're exactly right. So when I look at the world today, and I I comment on the fact that we have a very, very complicated supply chain, but it's impacted by so many other things that happen in the world just outside of what we can control within Canada and moving trains and trucks and vessels and operating terminals. It's when you look at the Ukrainian situation, and that's a major producer of grain products in Europe, that is creating a worldwide change in how grain is going to be supplied to different parts of the world. And the US grain crop right now is much stronger than the Canadian grain crop. So there's a demand right now for US grain to make it to port. Port of Vancouver is an option for US grain and grain products to get on a vessel. So there's demand for that's being looked at and asked about. The Canadian grain crop that we saw this year was an anomaly that we haven't seen in a lot of years. And it's not to say that it won't be a lower crop next year, but expectation is if you have a normal crop next year, you have strong demand for potash across the world, being impacted again by the Ukrainian situation. You continue to have demand in coal and other products. Robert's exactly right, is that we need to manage our corridor and look beyond just one commodity. It's looking at the overall supply chain and the changes that we're seeing that are impacted by things way outside of our control. So those are the types of things that as a railway, when we think about risk, thinking about risk and thinking about capacity, we're looking at all of the different commodities and all of the different drivers that are going to influence our need for resources, rail cars, crews, et cetera, and track capacity, which we continue to invest in on an annual basis. So, Robert, great point.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Okay, lots of questions in the chat box, gentlemen. We could talk about the question of this of the future coordination of the system. What are the vehicles that exist other than getting around the minister's table or getting around? Is there an institution that you would go to today to address the issues in the way that you think need to be addressed, or do you have to create a whole new one? Jeff?
You're picking on me, Martin.
Yeah, sorry.
It's a tough question. You know what? I always look at, when I look at the Vancouver Gateway, I think that this is the most coordinated gateway and the most organized gateway that I see across the entire country. When you look at the National Transportation funding that we get in Vancouver, it's a tribute to the federal government in the Pacific region that works with us, the Greater Vancouver Gateway Council, the Port of Vancouver, Westtac, the number of different stakeholder groups that bring us together. I think as we start to look at the bigger picture of investment and how we're going to solve resiliency over the next 10 to 15 years, I get concerned about too many people at the table. And I think effectiveness is lost as we get to too big a group. So I lean heavily on Mr. Xotta as a person to help bring people together, heavily on the Transport Canada folks on my side to bring the right people together. But I think it needs to be a small group of senior individuals that are talking about, as we are here today, all levels of the supply chain where we can make some decisions and at least put forward some recommendations. I would welcome other comments from the other panelists who may be closer to this than I am.
Yeah, I'll maybe just comment a couple of points. One is, there's a couple of questions in the chat about, resiliency or surge capacity and how that's funded. Strictly speaking, that is what the National Trade Corridor Fund is. It's an incentive where, whoever the actor is that might make an investment can't make the business case if they fund 100% of it. If we bring various people together, the cost offsets the risk that you'd face by not making that investment. And maybe just to pick up on Michael's point about the degree of dependence on very few West Coast ports to do Canada's trade, That's why I think we've seen a degree of success in accessing those funds. We have a strong book of business and a growth trajectory with our business that makes it viable for whether it's the port, CP, CN, or others to partner with the federal government. One of the things I observed in the flood conversations that we're having and the discussions that emerged from that was that I took a degree of comfort that both our federal and provincial governments have a degree of insight into what's going on in the supply chain that was surprisingly detailed. Not that I get access to that on a daily basis, but I was pleased to see both their jumping to action and the level of analytics that was behind some of what they were doing. And again, I would say this is why the National Trade Corridor Fund, you can see I'm a big fan, is elegant in the sense that it relies on the private sector bringing the priority projects together. So government isn't dictating; they're providing a pathway for good projects to get done, as Jeff has indicated. So. Who needs to do it? I think it needs to be us pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps in the various regions where we have challenges. We do need support, financial and otherwise, from Canada. That has been available to us, and I think it needs to continue, maybe in greater proportion in the future if Canada wants to see more resilience, more surge capacity sooner to respond to climate and other events that we anticipate.
Thank you. Dave, Earle, we haven't heard from you for a while. What's your take on this discussion that we've been having so far? Making sense to you? Unmute.
Sorry about that. Yeah. No, I mean, it absolutely does. One of the things that our industry, perennially struggles with, if you will, when we talk about the flow through of containers and product, the vast bulk of our sector, particularly right across the country, doesn't interact with the port directly. We're always that next piece, that next transload, that next element. And really when we look at the transparency and the fluidity that's required, it's that next tranche that really concerns us as well, in terms of how do we move that container, how do we move those goods, frankly, when they're unstuffed. What do we do with that? So we're always alive to that as well. But everything that's being discussed when we talk about the need to be able to move effectively, what I keep going back to and what our perennial issue is, as much as infrastructure is an issue, as much as all of those things are, all of the things we're talking about today are issues, we still need people to be able to do the work. We still need those individuals who are there. And it's been a perennial challenge for our sector and continues to be. And if I'm looking at what keeps me up at night, if I'm looking at where are our pressure points coming, that's where it's coming, and it's already happening. We know, we've seen this movie before. When our vacancy rate starts hitting around 15%, we end up with trucks with loads parked and not moving. So as much as we talk about transparency and doing all these things, this entire supply chain, we talk about that big picture element when it moves out of the gateway and those goods start moving on different modes of transportation. That's the part that concerns me, in terms of having that strategy. What do we do when, not if, when we can't move those goods? The winter of 2018, 2019, we hit a real pocket of unavailability. We were able to solve it by recruiting from different provinces, but what we saw at that point is mills in the interior not being able to move their dimensional lumber, and to the point that they were stockpiling it for up to 10, 11 days and had nowhere else to put it. If we didn't get trucks in to move it out, those mills were looking at curtailments. That's what keeps me up at night, is saying, how do we do this? As much as we can look at efficiencies and everything else, when you start spreading it out across that multimodal element, where are we going to have that capacity? And it's all about people.
All goes back to people.
Yep.
Yeah. Jeff, is that the same situation in rail? Are you having crewing issues?
You know what? We're not having necessarily crewing issues right now, but we are focusing on significant growth in 2022 and into 2023. So we're in a significant hiring process right now. I'm not saying that I won't be saying the same thing as Dave here in the coming months as we go through that process, but it is one that's high on our radar right now, is that hiring process. It's been so difficult coming through COVID in terms of understanding we've had lots of pockets where we've been impacted. We've been using managers to run trains, and now focusing on the growth that we see coming forward in the next year or two plus. We are heavily hiring, and we'll see how it goes. I'm hoping that we're successful, but you know, our industry is a tough one, and Dave talks about it 24/7. It's as the younger generation comes up, it's not necessarily always their first choice in terms of the lifestyle they're looking for, and we're working hard to find creative ways to make railroading a career of choice going forward.
Thanks for that. So we're coming close towards the end of our webinar today. Does any of the panelists want to, got anything they want to get off their chest, something that they need to say today?
Martin, I have one thought that I just like to leave everybody with, is that, you know, everybody asks about when is this crisis going to end? Is it going to be 2022, 2023? But I think we need to recognize that there are going to be structural changes to the entire supply chain that come out of COVID. That things will not go back to the way they were, even when things are, quote, back to normal. I think we're going to see more BCOs focused on things like doing import transload near port. That we saw was one of the big drivers for LA Long Beach, and that's going to require much more industrial land near the port in order to even handle the volumes that we do today, let alone talking about, you know, expansions coming from things. And then we're also going to see, I think, more BCOs focused on, you know, these sprinter services. Even after rates moderate, I think you're going to see some of the bigger BCOs continue to look at those smaller services, recognizing that in the future and when the next crisis comes, they don't want to be as dependent as they were before on the major shipping lines. So I think we all need to collectively be brainstorming and thinking about what are all these structural changes that are going to happen coming out of this crisis that weren't there before, and what those implications will be for the industry.
Martin, I just want to pick up on that, because I think there was a question in the chat about industrial land. There is no doubt that we're struggling as a region. I would say I can't say, sorry, whether that by proportion is greater than Los Angeles or lesser than Los Angeles. What we know is industrial land is in a state in the Lower Mainland where it's reaching a very, very difficult situation. So the driver for the industry will be to seek areas where activities can be done on land that's more affordable. Historically, or at least over the last 10 to 20 years, that's meant a migration of some activity to the Calgary area and maybe to other inland port locations. But recent events, as Michael has pointed out, has had industry want to preserve as much of that activity as close to the vessel as possible. So we have this conflict unfolding that I think may or may not enhance our region's competitive position. I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention, though, just in terms of response, most folks are aware and I think Bruce may have mentioned it, we opened up a 40-acre empty container storage depot just as an emergency response to the kind of the dynamic that was unfolding in the supply chain over the last number of weeks. And while I certainly agree that we need to get to decisions quicker for major projects, this was a project that came together from inception. The approval for the funding from Canada came together in about 10 days, and from zero to operating, we were about 50 days. Today, there's about 7,000 containers on that property, and that number is growing daily. So I just want to acknowledge that when we set our minds to it, we can do we can be nimble and do some innovative things. We need to do more of it.
Great. Well, great to end on a positive note, Peter. Thanks for chipping in on that one. So folks, attendees, you've had your 75-minute webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. Everyone, if you're not already a member of CILTNA and you're thirsty for knowledge and connections and networking and professional recognition in an international logistics and transportation body, look us up at CILTNA.com. Our gratitude goes to our 6 panelists for their time and their willingness to share the depth of their expertise, and to our Pacific Chapter Organizing Committee of this webinar. Thank you to, in Vancouver, Marion Robson, John Bourbonnier, Jackie Lee, and Molly Strachan. And in Ottawa, Rebecca Whalen. Thanks for the organizers. And goodbye to everyone. Maybe we'll see you again.